The date 1776 is very familiar to Americans and also to a lot of people outside of the U.S. as the year in which the U.S. declared independence from Great Britain. But a lot of other stuff happened that year, too. So what I'm going to do in this video is talk about some of the events that happened during the year 1776 that were not United States related, at least not at the time. First couple things I'm going to talk about are two books that were published near the beginning of the year in February and in March. The first book was The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. It was ultimately a 6-volume work published over a period of years. The first volume came out in February of 1776, and then later it was revised when later volumes came out. Now, the idea with this work is to trace the history of Rome from its height in the 1st century down to the end of the Roman Empire. In Volume 3, he wraps up with the end of the Western Roman Empire. And then in Volumes 4, 5, and 6, he talks about the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, in the medieval period. And he ends up with Volume 6 in the 16th century. It's a notable work not for the argument it makes about why Rome declined, because the argument he makes is that Rome declined because of the rise of Christianity. Modern historians don't think that's that they disagree with that analysis. And we have a lot more information now about Rome than Gibbon had in his time in the 18th century. But what's important about the book is not the argument that it makes. Although I guess you could say it's important in the sense of the history of ideas, and it contributed to the decline of Christianity in the West, I guess. But it's important it was a step along the way toward the development of history as a modern academic discipline, where historians nowadays look at primary sources and try to reconstruct the causation of events. They look at different events and try to establish causation among them. They try to find trends, but they're being analytical about it, and they're basing themselves on the primary sources. And then they cite their sources. That's also an important part of the process, so that the reader, other historians or general public reading that work can go and follow up and trace where those facts are purported to come from, so you can verify the data that's being presented in that book. Edward Gibbon lived in a time when that was not normal. Typically, history books were written as there were more works of literature than anything else. And actually, Gibbon himself, when he wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, that was also a literary work. It's written in an attractive style. It's aesthetically pleasing to read. But and that was something that was expected of history writing at the time. But history writing back then typically did not involve citing your sources, at least not in any systematic way. They typically did not worry about whether they were citing primary sources. And they tended not to be very analytical about it. They tended to, oftentimes it was moralistic in tone. They were trying to teach a moral lesson through the relation of history. So Gibbon is kind of a precursor to the rise of the modern discipline of history, which arose during the 19th century, of having a more dispassionate, analytical perspective that is not necessarily moralistic. The work is also really important for another reason, I would argue, which is that it planted in everyone's minds the idea that an empire must go through a decline phase. That's a normal part of an empire's existence. He wasn't necessarily the first person to talk about that idea, but he was the one who popularized it, and because of the importance of his book. And it was considered very important. It was, like, at the time, an excellent reference work on the history of Rome. It was extremely popular. It contributed, for example, to the rise of neoclassicism in architecture and art in the early 19th century because of the a renewed interest in Rome and the Roman aesthetic. But this idea that empires go through a decline became so entrenched in Western culture that it became like, nowadays, everyone kind of just in the general public thinks about empire in that way, such that people think about, well, other empires must have gone through a decline. In Ottoman historiography, there was this dominating idea that the Ottoman Empire had gone through a long period of decline, starting in the 1500s, comically, just an extremely long period of decline. This idea that like empires go through a rise phase and a decline phase. You'll often see other empires talked about in those terms of the empire rising and then declining, and then you're trying to mark, well, like, when did the decline start, and then what caused the decline. And this becomes a preoccupation for a lot of people thinking about empires in general, other empires. And then in contemporary times, like not, modern times, people will talk about current global powers or great powers and talk about, are they going through a period of decline? People have talked about that with regard to the U.S. Is the American empire in decline? The idea that an empire goes through decline is not, it's not like an objective fact that exists out there. It's a social construct that exists as part of our society. It's a social belief that is a filter through which we read history. Anyway, so decline of the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. That was the first one. The second book that was published a few weeks later was The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. This was a really important book in the development of the modern field of economics. He put forward some ideas that were unusual at the time, but later became economic orthodoxy. So at the time, in the 18th century, the dominant view in the West about economics was that the goal is for a country, talking about countries here, the goal is for a country to accumulate wealth by maximizing exports and minimizing imports. And therefore, you have a positive balance of trade, which basically results in you have an accumulating pile of cash. And the country with the biggest pile of cash is therefore the wealthiest country. And that was mercantilism. That was the dominating economic belief of the early modern period. Adam Smith believed that the wealth of nations, hence the title, that the wealth of nations comes not from having a big pile of gold, Scrooge McDuck style, but rather in how large your economy is, how much are goods and services flowing through the economy. That's what the wealth is. Another theme that comes up a lot in the book is the division of labor. The idea that if you have a set of workers, if you divide them up so that each one is doing one part of the process, then the total productivity will be much higher than if each worker is doing every part of the process at the same time. So, which is, of course, is a major part of the modern economy. Pretty much every production, everything that's produced is produced by means of division of labor, where different parts are produced at different stages. And then another idea of the book is that self-interest on the part of individuals in the market, buyers and sellers in the market, them acting for the sake of self-interest actually promotes the public good. Where each individual person might, for example, invest in a business, not because they're trying to improve society, but because they're trying to get a profit. They expect to get a profit off their investment. And if you have a ton of people doing that, the cumulative effect is that the entire economy grows. The businesses grow, and they provide services for the society as a whole, and all of society benefits from each individual acting selfishly. So The Wealth of Nations became a seminal work in the development of modern economics. And this idea, these are ideas that are, a core part of modern capitalism now. Okay, now let's shift from books to wars. I'm sure there were a number of wars going on during 1776, but I'll just talk about two of them. One of them, which broke out in 1776, was one of the Spanish-Portuguese Wars. It was fought in South America during 1776 to 77. The area that is modern-day Uruguay and southern Brazil was a contested region between Portugal and Spain, because Portugal had been colonizing Brazil, and Spain was colonizing Argentina, and the area kind of east of the Rio de la Plata, the Uruguay and the what is now the kind of extreme southern states of Brazil, was in that kind of frontier zone between those two colonies and was disputed between the two powers. 1776, one of the wars that took place between Spain and Portugal broke out, fighting over that territory. I don't know if it's a very notable war in any other respect. The one thing, I guess, there were a couple lasting effects. It was probably a minor war, but Pedro Antonio de Ceballos was the leader of the Spanish side of the war, and then he was appointed viceroy of Rio de la Plata. That was actually the beginning of the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata as a separate colony from Peru. Kind of the precursor of the modern country of Argentina, sort of. But that colony of the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata was established in 1776. And then the other war that I was going to talk about was the First Anglo-Maratha War, which actually began in 1775, but there was an important stage that happened in 1776. But let me give you the background. So during the time that the British were colonizing the eastern coast of North America and establishing the colonies that exist, Massachusetts and New York and New Jersey, etc., all along the coast of North America. At the same time those colonies are being established, the East India Company, which was an English private corporation, was going to India to do trade. And then in the course of the 1700s, they began establishing territorial control over some areas along the coast of India. And then they were being sucked into Indian geopolitics, geopolitics of the Indian subcontinent. Now, in 1775, the dominant power in India was the Maratha Empire, also sometimes called the Maratha Confederacy. It was a collection of loosely correlated, loosely connected polities through Western and Central India. And the main one was based in Pune in Maharashtra, what is now Maharashtra, like some distance east of Mumbai. So at the time, the East India Company had three zones that they operated along the coast of India. One was based in Calcutta, one was based in the south at Madras, and one was based on the west coast at Bombay. So the East India Company was along the coast, and then there were a bunch of countries in the subcontinent, the most important of which was the Maratha Empire. Now, there was a succession dispute in the Maratha Empire in 1775. And the East India Company officials that were based in Bombay inserted themselves into that conflict. They made a deal with one of the claimants to the throne that if they supported him, he would grant them a little bit more land. So at the time, Bombay was located at the very southern tip of Salsette Island. Right? I think actually it was a separate island at the time, and it's since been filled in. But anyway, Bombay was at this little southern tip. And then the deal was that Raghunath Rao, who was the claimant that they supported, would grant them the rest of Salsette Island. And also trade rights or something, some kind of trade concessions with the Maratha. Well, that was in 1775. The East India Company office in Calcutta heard about that and objected to it because they said, there was a certain hierarchy in the East India Company where major decisions by Madras and Bombay had to be approved by Calcutta first. Now, Bombay had entered into this deal without consulting Calcutta. So Calcutta said that treaty is null. They went to Pune and they negotiated a new treaty with the other side of the dispute. So not with Raghunath Rao, but with Madhav Rao. Madhav Rao. So the two claimants in the dispute were Madhav Rao II and Raghunath Rao. They went and negotiated with Madhav Rao II, or actually with his regent. There was a council of regents that was ruling on his behalf, led by Nana Fadnavis. So they negotiated with Nana Fadnavis to nullify that agreement. They still would get the island of Salsette, but they would not support Raghunath Rao, and they forced him into retirement. So that's in 1776. So a little bit roundabout way. Treaty of Purandar was that treaty that nullified the earlier treaty, recognized Madhav Rao II as the legitimate ruler of the Peshwa of the Maratha Empire, but the war continued because I'm not sure of the details, but I guess the Marathas signed a deal with the French, and the Bombay office objected to that, and so they continued fighting against the Marathas. And they ended up losing. There was so anyway, but this war, this first Anglo-Maratha war, was fought from 1775 to 1782. So it was exactly at the same time as the Revolutionary War in North America. But this was, strictly speaking, not the British fighting the Marathas. This was the East India Company fighting the Marathas. And it's called the First Anglo-Maratha War because there were several after this. Now, this first Anglo-Maratha War, the East India Company lost. In the later wars with the Maratha in the early 19th century, the East India Company did end up winning those wars and gaining territory in Western India as a result. All right, that's enough war talk. War is kind of depressing. Let's talk about death. There were two important royals who died during 1776, the King of Korea and the King of Burma. I'll talk about Korea first. April 22nd of that year, Yeongjo died. Yeongjo had been the ruler of Korea. He was a member of the Joseon dynasty, and he had ruled for just under 52 years. Koreans say 52 years because I think that's because they count years differently than in the West. But by the Western reckoning, it was 51 years, like 51 and a half years. He is very famous in Korean history. He's considered a very important figure, a very important king in Korean history. His reign was dominated by the fighting of factions. There were two major factions of officials in the Korean court at the time, starting in the late 1600s, leading in continuing into the 1700s, the Noron and the Soron factions. And he spent the bulk of his reign just trying to manage these two factions and reconcile them and maintain peace rather than have like constant, fighting and succession disputes between them. He also reformed the tax system and administration of the empire. He promoted learning. He, for example, tried to make agricultural manuals available to farmers in Korea. The most famous event in his reign was the death of his son, Crown Prince Sado, in 1762. There's a very tragic story that I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe everyone in Korea is familiar with this story. But his son it was problematic, the way he was behaving. He was causing a lot of problems. They couldn't get him under control. And so he was locked up in a box until he died. So that was very sad. So Yeongjo died in 1776, and he was succeeded by his grandson, who's called Jeongjo. And Jeongjo also, like his grandfather, he promoted Confucian learning, tried to make books available. He founded the Kyujangguk, the Royal Library, and as a place for a repository for books and the preservation of books. And by the way, he founded the Kyujangguk in 1776, the same year that he came to the throne. Both of the kings, both Yeongjo and Jeongjo, were great patrons of Confucianism and of learning, especially of practical learning. And their reigns are considered a high point of Korean history. The other king who died in 1776 was Hsinbyushin in Burma. He died on June 10th. Now, he is famous as a great conqueror. He waged wars with pretty much all of Burma's neighbors, waging wars against Manipur to the west, against Laos to the east. He invaded Siam, which is now known as Thailand. He sacked Ayutthaya, the capital of Thailand, and basically destroyed it and took away all of its artists, which this is a kind of a major threshold moment, a major watershed moment in Thai history. This is the end of the Ayutthaya period, which had been lasting for centuries. And while he was doing all of that, he was also dealing with 4 invasions by the Manchu rulers of China trying to conquer Burma, and he repelled all 4 of them. So he's considered a great military hero in Burma. but his wars greatly taxed the country. And maybe for that reason, when he died in 1776, his son and successor, Hsingu, completely departed from that old policy. No more wars, no more fighting. He even went so far as to not even defend certain territories, like that northwestern part of Thailand where Chiang Mai is. That was under Burmese control at the time. The Siamese went up and conquered it, and he didn't try to conquer it back. So the elites at the time, though, under Hsinbyushin, prior to Hsinbyushin's death in 1776, he had built this entire kind of power structure based around conquests. And the elites of the empire were benefiting from the conquests. He had these generals and stuff. And when Hsingu ended all the fighting, the military elites objected to that. And as a result, after 6 years on the throne, he was overthrown and ended up dying in a series of power struggles in 1782. So anyway, that was what was going on in Burma. Oh, Burma, by the way, is now called Myanmar. So, okay. Now we have some other stuff that was going on. We'll get more. Let's move over kind of more toward Europe now. James Cook was a famous British explorer of the Pacific. He led 3 British maritime voyages to the Pacific Ocean to do scientific observations, to do astronomical observations, and then at the same time to explore and try to find. The first 2 voyages, he was, in addition to observing eclipses and the transits of Venus and Mercury and stuff, in addition to that, he also was trying to find the southern continent that was presumed to exist, because geographers at the time noticed that there was a lot more land mass in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. And they suspected that there must be a continent in the far south of the world to balance out the land masses. And it turned out they were right. There was a continent in the far south called Antarctica, but they didn't find it. Cook came close during his second voyage to almost finding it. He came within 75 miles of the coast of Antarctica, but he never discovered it. But he did do a lot of exploration, he and his men, of the islands of the Pacific. They visited New Zealand a number of times. They visited Tahiti several times. They visited Australia during the first voyage. They visited other islands of Polynesia. During the third voyage, he had a different mission. He had to try to find the Northwest Passage, which was a kind of possible, turned out not to exist, but it was a hoped for maritime passage, seaway passage over the northern side of North America, so that people could sail from Europe to China by going around the northern side of North America. It turned out that didn't work because of the ice cap that was there that would prevent ships from doing that. But anyway, this expedition set out on July 12th, 1776. They departed Great Britain to sail around to the Pacific and look for the Northwest Passage around what is now Alaska. And then meanwhile, there was another expedition that was going to try to find the Northwest Passage from the other direction, from the Atlantic. But his expedition was going from the Pacific. So they sailed into the Pacific, they visited New Zealand again, Tahiti again, and then they went to Hawaii, and they were the first Europeans to visit Hawaii. And this was actually, by the time they got there, it was 1778. Then they sailed over to the coast of North America, and they visited what is now Oregon, and then sailed past Washington to British Columbia, what is now British Columbia, and then kept going up to what is now Alaska, and then sailed through the Bering Strait, and saw that there was a wall of ice, and therefore they couldn't sail around North America. So they turned around, they went back to Hawaii, where there was an altercation with the locals, and James Cook and several other men were killed on the beach on the big island of Hawaii. But that was in 1778. That's in the future at this point. Okay, a couple other European things. In the summer of 1776, there was the Voyage of the Palmipede. That was a prototype for a steam-powered riverboat The steam engine, which is the idea of a steam engine, was created. It was developed during the 1700s, and the idea was you take coal and you burn coal to boil water and use the steam from that to drive a piston. So that was a steam engine. And during the course of the 1700s, engineers slowly improved the design to make it more efficient. And then engineers were trying to find ways of applying this engine in other Originally, the steam engine was applied in coal mining. That's where it was first used commercially, but as a pump to pump water out of the coal mine. But engineers were looking for ways to apply the steam engine to other contexts. And so some engineers were trying to put them on boats and make them drive oars or drive paddles. And one of these engineers was named Claude François Dorothe de Jouffroy, who's not a famous scientist in the English-speaking world, but Jouffroy, I'll just call him Jouffroy. So he was one of these engineers, and he developed a steamboat and put a steam engine on a boat in the Deux River of eastern France, and had it powering oars, these little flapper oar type things, and had it go chug along the river. It more or less worked, but it was very slow, so it was not a commercially viable model. And this particular event of the Palmipede sailing in 1776, sailing, I don't know, is that the right word for it? Anyway, steaming along the Deux River, is not in itself a major event in the history of technology, but it is part of a process of, the history of technology is not about individual great eureka moments. It's about a long process of trial and error engaged in by many different scientists and engineers, and the development of steam power is one of those. But anyway, that I mentioned it only because it happened in 1776. That same year, I'm going to drop back a couple months, May 1st of 1776, getting away from technology now to something else. That was the founding of the Illuminati. The Illuminati was a secret society founded in Ingolstadt, Bavaria, in May of 1776 by a professor at the University of Ingolstadt. He formed it with 4 or 5 of his students. And the idea here was they loved the ideas of the Enlightenment that were happening during the 1700s. The Enlightenment was a intellectual movement that happened during the 1700s that promoted ideas of reason, empirical evidence, individual liberty, religious tolerance, separation of church and state. These were very controversial ideas at the time. And Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Illuminati, wanted to found a secret society that would promote those ideas. Secret societies were a very popular thing for young men to be involved with at that time period. They were very common. What they would do is they would meet, they would have these code names, they would have secret handshakes, they would meet in secret, and they would do, they would have rituals of initiation that were kind of pseudo-ancient initiation rituals. And the Freemasons are the most famous of these groups. But there were other groups too besides the Freemasons. Freemasons were probably the most widespread. Now, the Illuminati was founded in kind of a similar thing. They were kind of like the Freemasons, similar sorts of things going on, but with the idea of promoting secularism, promoting the Enlightenment. So it was founded in 1776 and started to make a name for itself. People started to hear about it because the people joining this secret society were not very secret about it. And so everyone knew that this existed. And then 9 years later, in 1785, the Elector of Bavaria, the ruler of Bavaria, outlawed all secret societies, including the Illuminati. And it died out after that. And that was the last anyone ever heard of the Illuminati. But the Illuminati became part of this, during the 19th century, there was this big ideological battle between people who were in favor of the ideas of the Enlightenment, ideas like democracy, popular sovereignty, individual rights, stuff like that. And then people who were opposed to the ideas of the Enlightenment. And the people who were opposed to the ideas of the Enlightenment oftentimes believed that these new ideas and the revolutions that were motivated by these ideas, the revolutions of 1830, or the French Revolution, 1789, most notably, and then 1830, 1848, and so on, that were sweeping across Europe during the 19th century and causing a great deal of upheaval. People who were opposed to those revolutions oftentimes thought that the revolutions were being orchestrated by hidden conspiracies, secret cabals of individuals who were involved in these. Sometimes they would believe that Jews were involved in these conspiracies. Sometimes they would believe that it was the Freemasons. Freemasons were a very popular scapegoat for them. And then the Illuminati are all kind of part of that. So as far as I know, that's why there are conspiracy theories in modern times regarding the Illuminati. I believe that's the intellectual history kind of origins of that idea. Okay. Now let's move over to North America, because there was the American Revolution and the accompanying Revolutionary War happening on the East Coast of North America, but there was also stuff going on out west. Obviously, there was stuff going on everywhere in North America. But I'll just mention a couple things. First of all, in 1776, that was the founding of what we now know as the city of San Francisco. What happened in 1776 was the foundation of the mission called St. Francis, or San Francisco in Spanish. And then a presidio was founded nearby. A presidio was a kind of fortress. Both of those were established in 1776 on the site of the modern city of San Francisco. And so San Francisco is considered to date from the year 1776. The mission was founded by Franciscan missionaries from Spain. At the time, Mexico was New Spain. It was part of the Spanish Empire. And missionaries during the 1700s started moving north into Alta California. Moving into Alta California, or the modern-day U.S. state of California, establishing missions all along the length of California, starting with San Diego in the very south of it, and then all the way up to San Francisco, and even a little bit past it, I believe. So the foundation of San Francisco was part of that broader process happening in the 1700s. And then at the same time, previously, in the 1600s, New Mexico had been founded. And there was a Spanish presence there for most of that time. There was a brief period when they'd been kicked out. But so in 1776, there was a colony in New Mexico around Santa Fe and that area. Now, with the Spanish in New Mexico and the Spanish in California, they wanted to see if they could establish an overland route directly from New Mexico to California. So in 1776, an expedition left Santa Fe to try to walk to California. It was led by a man named Domínguez, but the most famous member of the party was Escalante, Father Escalante, because he's the one who wrote the journal. And they walked across the Colorado Plateau. You have the 4 states that make up kind of around the 4 corners. There's New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona, kind of next to each other. That's the region through which they walked. They walked over to modern-day Utah. They visited Utah Lake, but ended up giving up and went back to Santa Fe. They felt like they couldn't make it over there. So they went this long journey around the Colorado Plateau. So that's another thing that happened in 1776. They were the first Europeans to visit Utah. All right, so that's all the events that I accumulated. There were a couple others that I didn't include, but all right. So if there's anything I left out, let me know in the comments. If there's anything I messed up, let me know in the comments. I was thinking about this when I was putting this together. I'm like, I'm not an economist. How am I going to talk about wealth of nations? So if you're an economist and I got the wealth of nations wrong, if I misunderstood Adam Smith, put in the comments. If there are corrections, that would actually be helpful to other people reading the comments. So that'd be great. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.